my name is Nicoletta Heidigger, and I'm a marriage and family therapist and sexologist, and today I'm going to be talking to you about sex addiction, or as I like to call it, out of control sexual behavior. Is sex addiction a real thing? In short, no. Some of you might be confused by this answer, so let me break it down by using an example. I took this quote from a colleague of mine named Dr. David Lay, and he says, "If someone walks through the door and is sneezing, I'm not going to diagnose them with a sneezing disorder. I'm going to try to figure out what the real problem is, and then treat them appropriately." So when you walk through the door of a sex addiction facility, they're always going to say, aha, sex is the problem. So just like if somebody's sneezing, it may be caused by a cold, by a virus, by dirt getting in their nose. The same thing is true for an issue related to sex and sexuality. It could be caused by a lot of different things. So for what we know right now about research and according to all the psychological associations out there, sex addiction is not a real disorder. But there are times when sex and sexuality can become problematic for some people. So sex might be something that causes stress for you, even if it's a part of your job. So there are times when sexual behavior doesn't feel good, feels out of control, or seems to cause issues in one's relationships, in their life, in the sense of shame or how they feel about themselves, and can cause a lot of issues in somebody's life. So we wouldn't call this sex addiction, but we may call it problematic sexual behavior that impacts somebody negatively. So there's an ongoing dialogue still in the mental health community about whether sex addiction exists. And it's going on, but basically, according to all the organizations out there for now, it's not something that's listed as a diagnosis. So when we look in the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, you don't need to know all these names, but it basically says that it's not a thing. Instead, researchers are now calling it out of control sexual behavior. And what that means is engaging in behaviors that feel out of control for you. And so why is it not an addiction? Addiction in the brain for other things looks different than it does for somebody who is maybe considered hyper or very sexual. So there was a researcher at UCLA named Dr. Nicole Prause, and when they looked at the brains of folks who were labeled as sex addicts or very sexual, it didn't look the same as addicts of other things, meaning the parts of the brain that light up for, say, like somebody addicted to cocaine, didn't light up for sex addicts when they were looking at sex, like they did for cocaine addicts when they were looking at cocaine. So the same mechanisms are not happening in the brain. In addition, the term sex addiction is pretty vague and general. So I've heard it used for people who cheat on their spouses or partners a lot. I've heard it used for people who masturbate once a day, which like maybe we're all guilty of. So I've heard it used for a plethora and a variety of different people. That doesn't make it an addiction. Also, sex addiction historically has been used as a way to shame and control people's sexual behavior. So in the past, the word sex addiction or the concept of it was used to judge people in the gay and queer community. It's definitely been used to judge sex workers. It's been used to judge people who just have a high libido, and also for people who like to pleasure, self-pleasure, and masturbate. So let me tell you a little bit about the issues with the sex addiction model and what you can do for yourself if you are still having trouble with the sex that you're having in your life. So if we're operating from a sex addiction mentality, then most sex workers and performers might be labeled as sex addicts, which I say, fuck that. So another thing that's wrong with the sex addiction model is that it's one size fits all. So context is not considered, other things that are going on in a person's life aren't considered, and sex is seen as the problem as opposed to other underlying things that might be going on. Another thing is that it's very shaming and pathologizing, and it kind of asserts that there's a normal and a healthy way to have sex and a way of having sex. But as you probably know, there are lots of normal and fun and healthy ways to have a great sexual relationship. Another thing is it really stigmatizes sexual minorities. So that could be sex workers, especially sex workers of color, other people of color, people in LGBT communities, because in the past, like I said, sex addiction has been used to describe people who were doing sex things that made other, maybe more puritanical people uncomfortable. Here are some assumptions about the sex addiction model, and these were created by another guy named Marty Klein. He says that the issues with the sex addiction model basically say that it asserts that sex and sexual desire are dangerous, that there's only one best way to express your sexuality, which is very limiting, that there are laws and social norms that define sexual health and tell you how to be sexually healthy, and that imagination or fantasy has no healthy role in sexuality. It also says that people need to be told what kinds of sex are wrong and bad, so it's very judgmental. And it also says that if you feel out of control, that you are out of control, as opposed to you may just be feeling out of control, but you can actually do something about it and have control over it. So sex and sexual behavior in the sex addiction model is considered bad, and there's an expectation that there's a right way to do it and to have a healthy sexuality. In addition, it's very culturally influenced. So our culture may have some views about what kind of sex is right, but if you go somewhere else, they're going to have other views about what kinds of sex look okay. So it really varies from culture to culture and place to place. In addition, I think it's also pretty sexist. So for example, if, a male-bodied person is hooking up with a lot of people, he might be considered like a pimp in a good way, and people might respect that. But if I, as a female-bodied person, am talking about how I'm hooking up with a new person every night, I might be labeled a slut. Okay, so this might not be feeling helpful for you if you're still feeling out of control in your own sexual behavior. So, what can you do if you're struggling and your sex feels out of control? The first thing I would do is to ask yourself, is my sex problematic to me, and why? And a few other questions you can ask yourself after that is, do you really think your sex is problematic, or is somebody else telling you that? So is a partner struggling with maybe a sexual behavior that you have? And do you agree, and what would actually make the behavior problematic? Another question you can ask yourself is, how did you shape your ideas about sex and sexuality, and what is the culture that you're coming from, and what does that culture believe about sex and sexuality? This can really help get to the narrative about how you feel about what kinds of sex is healthy for you. Another question you can ask yourself is, who has told you or decided what healthy sex looks like or is supposed to look like? And do you really, at your core, agree with it? Or do you just feel ashamed because you're not matching what you think it's supposed to be? One more question you can ask yourself is, how do you want your sex life to look, and how do you want it to be? Is the current relationship or relationships that you're in right now meeting your needs? The last thing I would say is to consider what some call the 6 principles of healthy sexuality. And I know I said a little bit ago that outside people shouldn't determine what's healthy sex for you, but I do think these are a couple boundaries that can be helpful to figure out if you're struggling to have sex that works for you, or if you're just feeling shame and stigma based on other people's views. So these are the 6 principles of sexual health. They were developed by a guy named Dr. Doug Braun Harvey, and he wrote a book called Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior. So the first principle is consensual. So that means that there is ongoing consent between adults, and it continues on for a time. Consent, I'm sure you've heard about it. Obviously, there can be issues that come up both in your personal relationships and in terms of consent when you're on set, which kind of leads me to my next principle, which is that it's non-exploitative. I think it's really important, obviously, that we do not stigmatize the sex work or adult industry for being exploitative or trafficking in any way, shape, or form. But obviously, if you're on set, there may be power dynamics that are happening, whether you want to impress the producer or you don't want people to not get paid for their performance job. Different roles of power can impact the ideas of consent and exploitation, especially when you're working. So that's something to consider. So again, the first principle is consent. The second one is that healthy sex is not exploitative. The third one is honesty. So it's all about being honest. That doesn't mean you have to share every fantasy that pops into your head unless you really want to, but it would be the difference between having a consensual, non-monogamous relationship with somebody versus cheating on somebody ongoing behind their back, or masturbating for 7 hours and locking yourself in the bathroom and not telling your partner why. The next would be it's risk aware. So some people would call this like sexual health safety. I prefer calling it risk aware because some of us might be interested in sex that has risks. So if you're into kink or BDSM, or you're at least doing it for work or for a scene, you may be willing to accept the risks. Like, you know that if you're going to be spanked hard, marks might be left. but you're still like, I know the risks, I want to do it. So healthy sex is risk aware, meaning that you know what the risks are, you're informed, and you're deciding to do it anyway. Another thing is shared values. So again, to use the monogamy or non-monogamy example, if you're dating somebody who really wants to be monogamous outside of your performance time, but you yourself want to be with many people and not be monogamous, then you may not be sharing in values together, and that may be a reason why you're stepping out on your relationship bounds. And then the last one is it pleasurable? So sure, there might not always be times where you're able to achieve orgasm and you're maybe doing certain things for the camera, but sex that you maybe want to be having should be pleasurable, or at least not make you feel like shit or ashamed or guilty. So if you're struggling with one of these 6 things, that may mean that there could be some out of control sexual behavior or something else going on. If one of the things before aren't going on for you and you're struggling with some of those components of sexual health, then what can you do? First thing is to find a sex therapist like myself or some of the other folks in these videos. And I would encourage you to find somebody who does not specialize in sex addiction. So this would be someone who labels themselves as sex positive, who also has information and is used to working with folks in the adult industry, because you don't want somebody assuming that because you're coming in that it has to do with your sex work, because that doesn't feel good and it can be really alienating and stigmatizing. Obviously, Pineapple Support is a really good resource for that, and they can help you get set up with a therapist. Another thing to do if you're struggling with that is to gain insight into what else is going on in your life. So I see out of control sexual behavior as a symptom, not a cause, meaning that there are probably other things going on underneath that are impacting your sexual behavior. So whether that be a personality disorder, depression, anxiety, not feeling good about yourself, there may be other things going on that are causing you to use sex as something that makes you feel better. One last thing you can ask yourself are, do the behaviors of sex that you're doing feel problematic to you? And if not, who told you they were, and are they right? Here's an example of some other things that could be going on as opposed to just labeling everything sex addiction. So it could be that somebody else has told you what normal sex should be and you feel pressured to abide by that. So that could be a religious organization, your family, or a partner that you're dating. It could be that the culture and the society that you live in has a view on what kind of sex that you're supposed to be having, and that makes you feel pressured and ashamed. There could also be, like I said, some underlying mental health concerns. So ones in this realm could be personality disorders, if you're struggling with substances, or if you're just struggling with self-control. One thing I like to also bring up is that sometimes sex addiction can just be used as an excuse. So there might be someone who is cheating on their partner or sexually assaulting people, and they say, well, I'm just a sex addict. I don't think that using that as an excuse is an okay thing and should be addressed. Next, I want to explore how some things can either be problematic or workable and fun, even though they're almost the same behavior. So one would maybe constitute as out of control, while another might be seen as workable and fun. All you really have to do is find the right partner and the right match and change your dialogue with yourself about the shame that you may feel engaging in the kind of sex that you're having. So one example, like I said earlier, is non-monogamy. So if you're dating somebody who wants to be monogamous outside of performing and you really don't want to be monogamous and you end up cheating on them, it may not be that you're a sex addict. You may just need to find someone who is also non-monogamous so you can enter in an honest, open dialogue and have as many partners as you two agree together. Another example of this is kink or BDSM. So it may be problematic if you're not consensually hitting people during sex or getting rough and aggressive with folks that you haven't talked about. But if you're engaged in a consensual daddy-dom little girl relationship and that's a part of your life and you found someone to do that with, that's a great relationship or could be a great relationship. Another example is sex work. So obviously, if you are engaged in any kind of like non-consensual exploitative sex work, that's a whole nother thing. Please contact one of our support things through Pineapple Support or something else. But I hope that if you're watching this, that you are enjoying the work that you're doing, or at very least, doing it because capitalism sucks. Another thing that can be potentially problematic versus workable and fun is watching porn. So if you are watching porn in secret for like 7 hours a day and your partner doesn't feel like you can have sex with them and it's causing issues in your relationship, maybe that is problematic. But you could make it enjoyable and fun if you have a dialogue with them, tell them why it's important to you, and find a way to watch that together. I mean, it's been really normalized in our culture to binge watch 8 hours of Netflix, but if someone says, oh, I stayed home on Saturday and just watched 8 hours of porn to myself, then people have a judgment about that. So I would urge you to challenge yourself on where that difference comes from and how maybe some of our culture's puritanical views on sex have impacted what kind of self-care is okay. Last, I would love to talk about illegal interests. I won't go into this in depth because it's not really part of this conversation, but let's say that you are somebody who is an exhibitionist. You're in the right field if you are a sex worker in some ways or a cam person, but if you feel like you don't have an outlet for that and you end up flashing people non-consensually on the subway, that would be problematic. Versus you go to a sex party and you're able to have sex in front of people and be an exhibitionist and everyone watching loves it. So that would be workable and fun. For me, this kind of comes down to the idea of problematic sex is less about the sex itself and less about the behavior and more about how you handle it and how you feel about the behavior and finding the right partner and outlet and situation. Lastly, I would also like to say that sex can be a healing tool. I feel like a lot of this talk around problematic sex is kind of saying that it's bad to use sex as a coping skill or as an outlet. But I would encourage you to challenge that. I mean, sure, if you're only relying on it for the only thing to take care of yourself and it's causing issues in your life and your relationship, that may be something to look at. But if masturbating before you go to sleep every night helps you fall asleep, how is that any different than smoking a joint or watching a Netflix show or doing something else? Sex can be a really powerful way to self-soothe and to calm oneself, and I don't know if doing something that's very natural has to be seen as an addiction or something negative. So most importantly, I think instead of abstaining or avoiding sex if it feels like it's problematic for you, my goal is to really help folks improve the kind of sex that they want to be having and improve the ways that they feel about it so they don't feel ashamed and can interact with their life and the relationships in their life in a way that feels fulfilling for them. I know we couldn't get to everything today, but if you need more resources, you can find me at nicolettavheidegger.com. If you need more resources on challenging sex addiction or out of control sexual behavior, you can check out a book called The Myth of Sex Addiction by Dr. David Ley. You can check out the Harvey Institute or the work of Dr. Chris Donahue. And if you need therapy resources, reach out to Pineapple Support and hopefully they can set you up with somebody like me.